Quen 2.5 max in the small quiet town of Willow Creek, life moved at its own gentle pace. The air smelled of fresh earth and wildflowers, and the mornings were filled with birdsong. For James Carter, this was home, a place where he could live, simply, work hard, and enjoy the peace that came with running a family farm passed down through generations. James wasn't your typical farmer. He didn't wear overalls or chew on straw like people imagined farmers did. Instead, he was an easygoing man in his late 40s who loved tending to his crops and animals. His farm wasn't huge, but it was enough for him to make a living. Chickens roamed freely around the yard, cows grazed lazily in the fields, and rows of corn swayed gently in the breeze. It was a modest setup, but it meant everything to James. For years, James lived without much trouble. Sure, there were occasional complaints from neighbors about the early morning rooster crowing or the tractor rumbling down the dirt road, but nothing serious ever came of it. Everyone in Willow Creek knew each other, and most folks respected boundaries. That is, until things started changing. A few years back, developers arrived in town with big plans. They cleared acres of land just beyond James's property and built Meadowview Estates, a fancy new housing development marketed as luxury country living. At first glance, it seemed harmless enough. Neat rows of identical houses with perfectly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and shiny cars parked in driveways. But beneath the polished surface, trouble was brewing. The residents of Meadowview Estates weren't used to rural life. Many of them had moved from cities, looking for a taste of the countryside without actually dealing with its realities. To them, James's farm was, well, messy. Chickens wandering near their manicured hedges, unacceptable. The sight of muddy tractor tracks leading up to his barn, an eyesore. And don't even get them started on the smell of manure during planting season. It was apparently unbearable. At the center of all this discontent was Karen Hargrove, the self-appointed queen bee of Meadowview Estates. She was the kind of person everyone noticed, loud, opinionated, and always ready to voice her thoughts. As the president of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she took her role very seriously. Rules were rules, and Karen made sure everyone followed them, no matter how trivial they might seem. Whether it was enforcing strict lawn care schedules or banning holiday decorations outside designated dates, Karen ruled with an iron fist. When James decided to build a fence around his property, Karen saw red. The fence itself wasn't anything special, just simple wooden posts strung together with wire. But to Karen, it was a personal affront. In her mind, the fence ruined the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. Never mind that James's land predated Meadowview Estates by decades. Never mind that his farm operated under completely different zoning laws. All Karen cared about was making sure her precious HOA guidelines were followed to the letter. She sent letters to James demanding he tear down the fence. Each one grew more aggressive than the last, citing obscure clauses in the HOA bylaws about visual conformity and threatening fines if he refused. James read the letters, shook his head, and tossed them into the trash. He knew better than to engage with someone like Karen. Besides, his fence was staying put. It wasn't just for show. It served a practical purpose. Deer had been sneaking onto his property and eating his crops, and the fence was the only way to keep them out. But Karen wasn't the type to let things go. If anything, James's refusal to comply only fueled her determination. She began rallying her fellow HOA members, convincing them that James was a problem that needed solving. Meetings turned into heated discussions about what to do with that stubborn farmer. Some residents sided with Karen, eager to support her crusade against James. Others stayed quiet, unsure of how to navigate the growing tension between the two sides. Little did anyone know, this was only the beginning. What started as a minor disagreement over a fence would soon spiral into something far bigger and far messier than anyone could have anticipated. James tried to ignore the drama unfolding around him, focusing instead on his daily chores and keeping his farm running smoothly. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't going to stop anytime soon. And he was right. As days turned into weeks, The situation grew increasingly tense. Karen's relentless campaign against James became the talk of both Willow Creek and Meadowview Estates. Nobody could agree on who was in the wrong. Was James being unreasonable by refusing to play ball with the HOA? Or was Karen overstepping her bounds, trying to impose her will on someone who clearly didn't belong to her jurisdiction? One thing was certain. The battle lines had been drawn. And in the middle of it all stood James, a man who simply wanted to protect his farm and his way of life from those who didn't understand it. The tension between James and Karen only grew thicker as days passed. James had hoped that ignoring Karen's letters would make her back off, but she wasn't the kind of person to let things slide. If anything, her determination seemed to double with every passing day. She began showing up at random times near James's property line, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes like some sort of self-appointed inspector. Sometimes she'd bring along a few neighbors from Meadowview Estates, pointing dramatically at his fence and shaking her head as if it were the worst thing she'd ever seen. James tried not to pay attention. He had work to do. Cows to feed, crops to water, fences to repair. But it was hard to ignore the growing sense of unease creeping into his once peaceful life. Every time he stepped outside, he couldn't help but notice Karen lurking nearby, glaring at him through narrowed eyes. It felt like living under a microscope, constantly being watched and judged for no good reason. One Saturday morning, James woke up early, just as the sun was beginning to peek over the horizon. The air was crisp, and the dew clung to the grass in tiny, sparkling droplets. It was shaping up to be a beautiful day, so James decided to spend it reinforcing sections of his fence. Deer had been persistent lately, and he didn't want them slipping through weak spots and damaging his crops again. He grabbed his tools and headed out to the field, humming an old tune his father used to sing while working on the farm. While everything felt normal, the rhythmic sound of hammering nails echoed across the land, blending with the distant chirping of birds. But then something unusual caught his eye. A police cruiser pulling into his driveway. James froze mid-swing, the hammer still raised in his hand. What on earth could the police want? He hadn't done anything wrong. Setting the tool aside, he wiped his hands on his jeans and walked toward the car, his heart pounding with confusion. When he reached the driveway, the officer stepped out of the cruiser. He was a tall man with a calm demeanor, wearing the standard uniform and hat. James greeted him politely, asking what brought him out here. The officer hesitated before explaining that they'd received a call claiming James was trespassing onto HOA property while building his fence. Trespassing? James blinked, stunned. This had to be some kind of mistake. His fence was entirely within his own property lines. He'd made sure of that before starting construction. He quickly explained this to the officer, pointing out landmarks and natural boundaries that proved his case. Then he went inside to fetch his property deeds and survey maps, documents that clearly marked where his land ended and the HOA's began. While James rummaged through his files, Karen appeared standing smugly by her own car parked nearby. She crossed her arms and gave him a triumphant smirk, as though she'd already won whatever battle she thought they were fighting. James ignored her, focusing instead on finding the paperwork he needed. When he returned, the officer studied the documents carefully. After a few minutes, he nodded, looking apologetic. "Looks like you're in the clear," he said. "Sorry for the misunderstanding." James thanked him, relieved but frustrated. The whole situation felt ridiculous. He glanced over at Karen, who was now fuming silently. As the officer drove away, she stormed up to James, jabbing a finger in his direction. "This isn't over," she snapped. "You can't just do whatever you want. There are rules." James sighed, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "Karen," he said calmly, "my fence is on my property. I'm not breaking any laws. You're wasting your time, and everyone else's, with this nonsense." Her face turned red, and she sputtered angrily before stomping back to her car. Watching her drive off, James shook his head. He knew Karen wouldn't give up easily, but he also knew he was right. Still, the encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Over the next few weeks, Karen ramped up her efforts. She sent more letters, each one angrier than the last. Some of her neighbors joined in, signing petitions and sending emails to local authorities demanding action against James. They claimed his fence was unsightly, unsafe, and disruptive to their community. One letter even accused him of deliberately trying to provoke the HOA, which made James laugh out loud when he read it. Provoking them? All he wanted was to protect his farm. Despite the mounting pressure, James refused to budge. He continued working on his fence, making it stronger and more secure. He figured if Karen and her friends wanted to play games, he'd simply focus on what mattered most, keeping his farm safe and functional. But Karen wasn't about to let him off the hook so easily. She started organizing protests. Yes, actual protests. On weekends, groups of Meadowview Estates residents gathered outside James's property, holding signs with slogans like, "Respect our community," and "No more eyesores." They shouted chants and honked car horns, creating chaos that disrupted the peaceful atmosphere James had always cherished. Some even blasted loud music late into the night, hoping to annoy him into submission. At first, James tried to ignore it all. He stayed inside during the protests, focusing on indoor tasks like cleaning equipment or organizing supplies. But as the noise and hostility increased, it became harder to block out. Sleepless nights turned into groggy mornings, and the constant stress began taking a toll on his health. Then came the vandalism. Late one evening, James heard strange noises coming from the direction of his fence. Grabbing a flashlight, he cautiously stepped outside to investigate. What he found shocked him. Sections of the fence had been cut, wires dangling loose and posts knocked over. Footprints led away from the damage, disappearing into the darkness. Furious, but determined, James cleaned up the mess and repaired the damaged areas. But the attacks kept happening. Every time he fixed something, someone came back to sabotage it again. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. James knew deep down that Karen was behind it all, even if she never got her hands dirty herself. She was orchestrating the whole thing, rallying her supporters to harass him until he gave in. That's when James decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed security cameras around the perimeter of his property, positioning them strategically to capture any suspicious activity. At first, nothing happened. Days passed without incident, and James began to wonder if maybe the vandals had finally given up. But then, one night, the cameras caught something startling. Just after midnight, a figure crept onto his land, moving stealthily toward the fence. As the footage played back in grainy black and white, James recognized the intruder immediately. Karen. She was carrying a spray paint can and a pair of wire cutters. Without hesitation, she began defacing the fence, scrawling angry words across the wood and cutting through sections of wire. Watching the video, James felt a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone stoop so low? He knew Karen was stubborn, but this level of pettiness was beyond anything he'd expected. Still, he remained calm. The footage was undeniable proof of her wrongdoing, and now he had leverage. Armed with the evidence, James filed a formal complaint with local law enforcement. When officers reviewed the video, they promised to look into the matter thoroughly. Word spread quickly through Willow Creek and Meadowview Estates, and soon everyone was talking about the escalating feud. Some people sided with James, praising him for standing his ground. Others defended Karen, believing she was only trying to protect her community. For James, the wait was agonizing. He knew Karen wouldn't admit guilt easily, especially not in front of her fellow HOA members. But he also knew that justice would prevail eventually. And when it did, Karen's reign of intimidation would come crashing down around her. The tension between James and Karen reached a boiling point after the security camera footage surfaced. When the police finally confronted Karen about the video, she didn't go down without a fight. She showed up at the station wearing her signature, pressed blouse and tailored slacks, looking every bit the part of someone who believed she was untouchable. Her confidence was unshaken as she explained, rather dramatically, that she had only been inspecting the fence for safety violations. Wasn't doing anything wrong, Karen insisted, her voice sharp and defensive. That fence is a hazard to our community. Someone has to take responsibility. The officers exchanged skeptical glances but kept their expressions neutral. They played the grainy black and white footage for her, showing her sneaking onto James's property under the cover of darkness, spray painting graffiti on the fence and cutting wires with obvious intent. Karen's face flushed red when she realized there was no way out of it. Still, she refused to back down. "That video doesn't prove anything," she snapped, pacing back and forth in frustration. "It's taken out of context. You don't understand what I'm dealing with here." But the evidence spoke for itself. No amount of denial or deflection could erase what the cameras had captured. The officers informed Karen that they would be filing charges against her for criminal trespassing and vandalism. As much as she tried to argue her case, the law was clear. You can't destroy someone else's property, no matter how justified you think your reasons are. When news of Karen's legal troubles spread through Willow Creek and Meadowview Estates, reactions were mixed. Some residents of the HOA rallied behind her, convinced she was being unfairly targeted. "She's just trying to protect us," one neighbor said during a heated discussion at the community clubhouse. Others, however, began questioning whether Karen had gone too far this time. Even her most loyal supporters started whispering among themselves, wondering if her obsession with control had crossed a line. Meanwhile, James stayed focused on his farm. He wasn't surprised by Karen's reaction, or lack thereof, to the consequences of her actions. People like Karen always found ways to justify their behavior, even when caught red-handed. What did surprise him, though, was how quickly things escalated after the arrest warrant was issued. Karen didn't handle the situation well. In fact, she seemed to unravel completely. Days turned into weeks, and the stress of the investigation began taking its toll on her. She stopped attending HOA meetings, which was unusual for someone who prided herself on micromanaging every detail of the neighborhood. Rumors swirled about arguments with her husband, who reportedly grew tired of her constant drama. Neighbors claimed they overheard shouting matches late at night, followed by long stretches of silence. Then came the day when Karen's husband packed his bags and left. Nobody saw it coming, at least not publicly, but looking back it made sense. Living with someone so consumed by anger and entitlement must have been exhausting. Without her partner by her side, Karen became increasingly isolated. Gone was the confident woman who strutted around Meadowview Estates like she owned the place. In her place stood someone desperate, bitter, and lashing out at anyone who dared challenge her. Despite all this, Karen still refused to admit defeat. She hired a lawyer to defend her in court, hoping to spin the narrative in her favor. Her defense team argued that James's fence posed a legitimate threat to the community's safety and aesthetics, claiming that Karen's actions were motivated by concern rather than malice. But their arguments fell flat when James's attorney presented irrefutable proof. Surveys showing the fence was entirely within his property lines, photos of the damage Karen caused, and testimony from neighbors who witnessed her aggressive behavior firsthand. As the trial date approached, tensions in Willow Creek reached an all-time high. People took sides, turning what should have been a simple property dispute into a full-blown community feud. Supporters of James praised him for standing up to bullying, while Karen's defenders accused him of deliberately provoking the HOA. Conversations at the local diner and grocery store revolved around the case, with everyone speculating about how it would end. James, for his part, tried to stay above the fray. He knew better than to engage in gossip or retaliate against those who criticized him. Instead, he focused on repairing his fence, reinforcing it with stronger materials to ensure it could withstand both wildlife and human interference. He also spent more time outdoors, enjoying the fresh air and reconnecting with the land he loved so much. It was therapeutic in a way, a reminder of why he chose this life in the first place. On the morning of Karen's court appearance, the atmosphere in town was electric. Reporters from nearby cities arrived to cover the story, dubbed the Great Fence Feud. Cameras lined the courthouse steps and spectators filled the gallery, eager to witness the showdown between James and Karen. For many, it felt like a David versus Goliath battle, the quiet farmer versus the domineering HOA president. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings unfolded methodically. Prosecutors laid out their case, presenting the damning surveillance footage along with expert testimony confirming James's ownership of the disputed land. Witnesses recounted instances of harassment and vandalism, painting a picture of Karen as someone who let her ego override common sense. Karen's lawyer fought back fiercely, attempting to portray her client as a misunderstood advocate for her community, but the jury wasn't buying it. They listened intently to both sides, weighing the evidence carefully before retiring to deliberate. Hours passed and the wait felt interminable for everyone involved. Finally, the verdict came, guilty on all counts. Karen sat motionless in her chair, staring straight ahead as the judge announced her sentence. She was placed on probation, ordered to pay restitution for the damages she caused, and banned from setting foot on James's property ever again. The room erupted into murmurs, some relieved, others outraged. Outside, reporters scrambled to capture reactions from the crowd, while Karen slipped quietly out of the courthouse, avoiding eye contact with anyone. For James, the verdict brought a sense of closure. It wasn't about revenge or winning. It was about justice. He had worked hard to build a life for himself on that farm, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. As he walked home that evening, the sun setting behind the fields, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. The battle may have been long and exhausting, but it was worth it. Back in Meadowview Estates, the fallout continued. Many residents distanced themselves from Karen, embarrassed by the negative attention the case had brought to their community. Others apologized to James directly, admitting they regretted letting things spiral so far out of control. Slowly but surely, the animosity began to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. Karen, meanwhile, retreated from public life altogether. She sold her house in Meadowview Estates and moved away, leaving behind the chaos she had created. Some wondered if she'd learned anything from the experience, while others hoped she'd find a way to move forward without causing harm to those around her. As for James, he returned to his routine, grateful to put the drama behind him. His fence stood tall and sturdy once again, a symbol of resilience and determination. And though the scars of the conflict lingered, they served as a reminder of the strength it takes to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you. The courtroom was packed on the day of Karen's trial. People from all over Willow Creek had turned out to witness what many were calling the most dramatic event in town history. Reporters with microphones and cameras lined the courthouse, steps eager to capture every detail of the case that had divided the community. Inside, the seats were filled to capacity. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers crammed together, whispering among themselves as they waited for the proceedings to begin. James arrived early, dressed simply in a clean button-down shirt and jeans. He wasn't one for flashy appearances, but he wanted to show respect for the court. As he took his seat near the front, he could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him. Some looked at him with admiration, others with curiosity, and a few with thinly veiled hostility. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to let the attention rattle him. This wasn't about pride or ego. It was about standing up for what was right. Karen entered the room shortly after, flanked by her lawyer. She walked stiffly, her usual confidence replaced by an air of defiance mixed with nervousness. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She avoided making eye contact with anyone, especially James. Sitting down at the defendant's table, she clutched her purse tightly, as if it might offer some kind of comfort. As the judge called the court to order, the room fell silent. The prosecution began laying out their case, presenting evidence piece by piece. First came the surveillance footage, played on a large screen for everyone to see. It showed Karen sneaking onto James's property late at night, spray painting, graffiti on the fence, and cutting wires with deliberate intent. Gasps rippled through the audience as they watched her actions unfold in plain sight. There was no denying what she had done. Next, prosecutors introduced documents proving James's ownership of the land. The surveys and deeds left no room for interpretation. The fence was entirely within his property lines. Expert witnesses testified about zoning laws and property rights, explaining how Karen's claims of jurisdiction over James's farm were baseless. One neighbor, who had initially supported Karen, even took the stand to describe how she had pressured residents into signing petitions against James. Karen's lawyer fought back hard, attempting to paint her client as someone acting out of concern for the community's safety. "This isn't about personal vendettas," he argued passionately. "My client saw a potential hazard and took steps to address it. Yes, perhaps her methods were misguided, but her intentions were noble." But the prosecution dismantled this argument quickly. They pointed out that Karen had never once approached James directly to discuss her concerns. Instead, she resorted to intimidation, harassment, and outright vandalism. The security footage alone proved that her actions weren't motivated by altruism. They were driven by spite. Throughout the trial, Karen remained silent, her expression unreadable. Occasionally, she whispered something to her lawyer, but otherwise she seemed detached, as though she couldn't believe this was really happening. When it came time for her to testify, her voice wavered as she tried to justify her behavior. "I was protecting my community," she said firmly, though her hands trembled slightly. "That fence is ugly, dangerous, and disruptive. Someone had to do something." Her words sparked murmurs in the crowd. Some nodded sympathetically, while others rolled their eyes. James sat quietly, listening without interruption. He didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the jury finally reached a verdict. The judge instructed the courtroom to remain quiet as the foreperson stood to deliver the decision. The tension in the air was palpable. You could hear a pin drop. "On the charge of criminal trespassing, we find the defendant guilty," the foreperson announced. A collective gasp swept through the room. Karen's shoulders slumped visibly, but she kept her head bowed, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. "And on the charge of vandalism, we find the defendant guilty." The gavel struck, sealing Karen's fate. She was sentenced to probation, ordered to pay restitution for the damages she caused, and banned from stepping foot on James's property ever again. The judge's tone was firm but fair, as he reminded her that the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of status or position. When the hearing concluded, chaos erupted outside the courthouse. Reporters shoved microphones toward James, asking how he felt about the outcome. He answered calmly, reiterating that he had only ever wanted to live peacefully on his own land. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. "All I did was build a fence to protect my farm. That shouldn't have been controversial." Meanwhile, Karen slipped away quietly, avoiding the press and the angry glares of those who felt betrayed by her actions. She climbed into her car and sped off, leaving behind the life she had built in Meadowview Estates, or rather, the illusion of control she had clung to so desperately. Back in the neighborhood, reactions were mixed. Some residents expressed relief that the ordeal was finally over, while others grumbled about the negative publicity the HOA had received. Over the following weeks, cracks began to form within the organization itself. Without Karen's domineering presence, many members realized just how toxic the environment had become under her leadership. Attendance at HOA meetings dwindled, and eventually the group disbanded altogether. For James, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a public spectacle. Neighbors who had once sided with Karen approached him to apologize, admitting they regretted letting things spiral so far out of control. One elderly woman even brought him a basket of homemade cookies, thanking him for standing up to Karen when no one else would. Despite the apologies, James knew the scars of the conflict would linger. His farm had been vandalized repeatedly, and the stress of the legal battle had taken its toll on him physically and emotionally. But he refused to let bitterness take root. Instead, he channeled his energy into rebuilding, not just his fence, but his sense of peace. He spent long hours outdoors tending to his crops and animals, finding solace in the rhythm of farm life. One sunny afternoon, as he worked on reinforcing a section of the fence, a young boy from Meadowview Estates wandered over to watch. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing sneakers caked with mud and clutching a handful of wildflowers. "Are you the farmer who won the big fight?" the boy asked innocently. James chuckled, setting down his tools. "I guess you could say that," he replied. "Why do you ask?" The boy grinned and held out the flowers. "My mom says you're brave. These are for you." Taken aback by the gesture, James accepted the bouquet with a smile. "Well, thank you," he said. "Tell your mom I appreciate it." As the boy ran off, James stood there for a moment, holding the flowers. It was a small act of kindness, but it meant more to him than he could put into words. In that moment, he realized something important. The battle hadn't just been about fences or property lines. It had been about showing people that standing up for yourself doesn't mean tearing others down. It's about finding strength in doing what's right even when it's hard. And so, James continued working on his farm, one post at a time. The fence now stood stronger than ever, not just as a barrier to keep deer out, but as a symbol of resilience. Life in Willow Creek wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful again, and for James, that was enough. The weeks following Karen's trial brought a strange sense of calm to Willow Creek, but it wasn't the kind of calm that comes from resolution. It was more like the quiet after a storm. The air still carried traces of tension and whispers. About the fence feud lingered in conversations at the local diner, grocery store, and even church. People were divided, unsure whether justice had truly been served or if the whole ordeal had simply left scars that would never fully heal. For James, life slowly began returning to its familiar rhythm. He spent his days tending to the farm, fixing damaged sections of the fence, and caring for his animals. Yet despite the routine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, both within himself and in the community around him. The battle with Karen had taken its toll, not just on his property but also on his spirit. There were moments when he wondered if standing up to her had been worth all the stress, sleepless nights, and hostility. But then, he'd look out over his land, the fields stretching wide under the open sky, and remind himself why he fought so hard. This place wasn't just his livelihood, it was his home, his sanctuary, and no amount of drama could change that. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to disappear from public view almost entirely. After the trial, she stopped attending HOA meetings. Not that there were many left to attend. Without her iron grip, the organization crumbled into disarray. Some members tried to keep things going, organizing cleanup days and holiday events, but without Karen's relentless energy, or tyranny depending on who you asked, interest waned. Eventually, the HOA disbanded altogether, leaving Meadowview Estates residents to fend for themselves when it came to maintaining their shared spaces. Rumors swirled about what happened to Karen after the trial. Neighbors claimed they saw moving trucks parked outside her house late one night, loading boxes and furniture onto a trailer. Others said her husband had filed for divorce, unable to endure the embarrassment and strain caused by her actions. Whatever the truth, Karen vanished from Willow Creek as suddenly as she had become its center of attention. For some, her departure felt like closure. For others, it raised questions about accountability and forgiveness. In the absence of Karen's influence, the relationship between James and his neighbors began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a nod of acknowledgement here, a friendly wave there. Then came the apologies. One by one, residents from Meadowview Estates approached James, sheepishly admitting they regretted joining Karen's crusade against him. "Didn't realize how far she'd go," one man confessed, standing awkwardly at James's gate one afternoon. "We thought we were doing the right thing, protecting our neighborhood, but looking back, well, it wasn't fair to you." James listened patiently, nodding as the man spoke. He didn't hold grudges easily, and he appreciated the effort it must have taken for someone to swallow their pride and admit they were wrong. "It's water under the bridge," he said finally, offering a small smile. "Let's just move forward." Others followed suit, bringing gifts or offers of help. A group of women dropped off a casserole one evening, insisting James take a break from cooking for himself. A retired carpenter offered to lend a hand repairing the fence, saying he owed James for staying silent during the worst of the protests. Slowly but surely, bridges were rebuilt, not just between James and his neighbors, but within the community itself. Still, Not everyone was ready to forgive and forget. Some residents continued to resent James, blaming him for exposing the HOA's flaws and tarnishing the reputation of Meadowview Estates. They muttered about him behind closed doors, accusing him of being stubborn and uncooperative. To them, the trial hadn't settled anything. It had only highlighted the divide between rural values and suburban expectations. James heard the gossip, of course. In a small town like Willow Creek, secrets didn't stay hidden for long. But instead of letting it bother him, he chose to focus on the positives. Life was too short to dwell on negativity, especially when there was so much beauty in the world around him. Every sunrise painted the fields in golden light. Every breeze carried the scent of fresh hay, and every day brought new opportunities to appreciate the simple joys of farming. One evening, as James sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on everything that had happened. The fight with Karen had tested him in ways he never expected. It forced him to confront not only external challenges, but also internal doubts about his ability to stand firm in the face of adversity. In the end, though, it reinforced something he'd always known deep down, that peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the strength to rise above it. The next morning, James woke up early, as he always did. The dew sparkled on the grass, and the roosters greeted the dawn with their usual enthusiasm. He grabbed his tools and headed out to the fence line, inspecting each post and wire to ensure it was secure. As he worked, he noticed something unusual, a handmade sign nailed to one of the posts near the edge of his property. Curious, he walked over to examine it. The sign was simple, crafted from a piece of plywood and painted with bright colors. In bold letters, it read, "Welcome to Freedom Farms." Beneath the words, someone had drawn a cartoon cow, a chicken, and a tractor, complete with exaggerated wheels and a plume of smoke trailing behind it. James chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. Whoever had made the sign clearly had a sense of humor and an appreciation for irony. Freedom Farms? He liked the sound of that. Later that day, while chatting with a neighbor who stopped by to borrow some eggs, James mentioned the sign. "Oh, that?" The neighbor laughed. "That was my kid's idea. She heard all the stories about your fence and wanted to do something nice. Guess she figured you earned the name." James smiled, touched by the gesture. Kids had a way of seeing things differently, cutting through the noise of adult disagreements to find joy in the simplest moments. Maybe that's what this whole experience had taught him. That sometimes the best way to deal with conflict is to let it go and focus on what really matters. Over time, the sign became a symbol of resilience and hope, not just for James, but for the entire community. Visitors passing through Willow Creek would stop to snap photos of it, intrigued by the story behind the quirky artwork. Locals started referring to James's farm as Freedom Farms, and eventually, he embraced the nickname. It fit, in a way. His farm represented freedom, not just from Karen's harassment, but from fear, doubt, and the need to please everyone else. As months turned into years, the memory of the fence feud faded into legend. New families moved into Meadowview Estates, unaware of the drama that had once consumed the neighborhood. When they asked about the odd wooden sign on James's fence, older residents would chuckle and share snippets of the tale, embellishing details to make it sound even more dramatic than it actually was. James didn't mind. If anything, he found it amusing how the story grew with each retelling. Through it all, James remained grounded, focused on the life he loved. He expanded his farm little by little, planting new crops and experimenting with sustainable practices. He hosted tours for school groups, teaching kids where their food came from and encouraging them to ask questions. He even started selling fresh produce at a roadside stand, attracting customers from miles away with promises of farm-fresh eggs and honey straight from the hive. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bad harvests, broken tractors, and rainy days that kept him cooped up indoors. But it was good. Better than good, actually. It was fulfilling. James had weathered the storm, and in doing so, he'd discovered a deeper connection to his land, his community, and himself. And as he stood there one crisp autumn morning, gazing out over his fields, with the wind rustling through the corn stalks, he realized something important. Fences aren't just barriers, they're boundaries. Boundaries that define who we are, what we value, and where we draw the line. For James, that line was clear. It ran straight through his heart, dividing the past from the future, chaos from calm, and struggle from triumph. Freedom Farms wasn't just a name, it was a promise. A promise to live authentically, to stand strong in the face of adversity, and to cherish the land that had given him so much. And as long as James Carter remained its caretaker, it would continue to thrive, one fence post at a time. As the years rolled on, Willow Creek settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal again. The scars of the fence feud were still there, but they began to fade like old paint weathering under the sun. James's farm, now affectionately known as Freedom Farms, became more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol of resilience, standing tall against challenges both big and small. For James, it wasn't about proving a point or winning some imaginary battle. It was about creating something meaningful, something that brought people together instead of tearing them apart. The handmade sign at the edge of his property remained a fixture, its colors slightly faded, but its message as bold as ever. Welcome to Freedom Farms. Over time, it drew curious visitors from neighboring towns. Some came for fresh produce, others out of sheer curiosity after hearing snippets of the legendary feud. But what surprised James most was how many came simply because they admired what he represented. A quiet determination to live life on his own terms while respecting the world around him. One day, a young couple stopped by the roadside stand where James sold eggs, honey, and seasonal vegetables. They introduced themselves as newcomers to Meadowview Estates, explaining that they'd heard stories about the fence war and wanted to meet the man behind the legend. James laughed, brushing off their praise with a humble wave. "It's not as exciting as it sounds," he said, handing them a basket of freshly picked apples. "Just a farmer trying to keep deer out of his crops." But the couple didn't leave it at that. As they chatted, they revealed that they had moved to the area specifically because of James's story. "We read about you online," the wife explained, pulling up an article on her phone. It turned out that local journalists had written pieces about Freedom Farms, framing it as a tale of perseverance and community healing. The couple admitted they were tired of city life and looking for a place where people valued authenticity over appearances. Hearing about James's fight and eventual triumph had inspired them to take the leap. James listened thoughtfully, feeling a mix of pride and humility. He hadn't realized his little farm could have such an impact. To him it was just home. But to these strangers it was proof that standing up for yourself doesn't mean shutting others out. It means finding common ground, even when it feels impossible. Word spread quickly among new residents of Meadowview Estates. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood transformed. Gone were the rigid rules and obsessive focus on aesthetics that Karen had championed. Instead, people embraced a more relaxed way of living. Gardens sprouted in backyards. Chickens clucked happily. In coops, and tractors occasionally rumbled down dirt roads without complaint. The HOA may have disbanded, but a sense of camaraderie took its place. Neighbors helped each other build sheds, share tools, and swap recipes. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made all the difference. For James, this shift was evident in the way people interacted with him. No longer did he feel like an outsider looking in. He was part of the fabric of the community, welcomed, with open arms rather than crossed swords. Kids from nearby houses would often visit Freedom Farms, giggling as they chased chickens or marveled at the calves in the pasture. Parents brought dishes to potluck dinners hosted in James's barn, grateful for the chance to connect with someone who reminded them of simpler times. Even the protests and late-night noise that once haunted James seemed like distant memories. Occasionally, he'd catch glimpses of vandalism attempts, scratches on the fence or rocks thrown into his driveway, but they were rare and half-hearted, as if whoever was responsible couldn't muster the same energy anymore. James didn't let it bother him. He knew better than to dwell on negativity when so much good surrounded him. One crisp spring morning, James received an unexpected visitor. A middle-aged woman stood hesitantly at his gate, clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. She looked nervous, fidgeting with the stems as James approached. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. I'm sorry for everything," she said softly. "I was one of the ones who signed those petitions against you. I regret it now. You didn't deserve any of that." James studied her face, searching for sincerity. Then he nodded slowly, offering a reassuring smile. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "Apologies aren't easy, and I appreciate the effort. Let's just move forward." Tears welled up in the woman's eyes as she handed him the flowers. "Your farm is beautiful," she whispered. "And so are you, for forgiving us." Moments like these reminded James why he chose to stay rooted in Willow Creek despite everything. People weren't perfect. They made mistakes, acted out of fear or ignorance, and sometimes hurt others unintentionally. But they also carried the capacity for growth, for learning, for change. And James believed in giving them the space to do just that. By summer, Freedom Farms had become more than just a working farm. It was a gathering place. James hosted weekend events where families could pick strawberries, tour the fields, and learn about sustainable farming practices. Local musicians played acoustic sets under the shade of ancient oak trees, their melodies blending with the hum of cicadas. Artists set up easels near the fence, capturing the golden hues of sunset over the rolling hills. Even photographers arrived, eager to capture the charm of rural life for social media posts and gallery exhibits. Through it all, James stayed grounded. He wasn't interested in fame or fortune. He just wanted to share the beauty of his farm with anyone willing to see it. His favorite moments were the quiet ones, watching children chase fireflies at dusk, sharing stories with elders who remembered farming before technology changed everything, or sitting alone on his porch as stars blinked awake in the night sky. Still, there were reminders of the past that refused to disappear entirely. One afternoon, while mending a section of the fence damaged by yet another anonymous act of mischief, James found a note tucked between two posts. Unfolding it carefully, he read the hastily scrawled words, "You'll never belong here." For a moment, anger flared within him, not because of the insult itself, but because it represented everything he'd worked so hard to overcome. Hatred and division had no place on Freedom Farms. Taking a deep breath, James crumpled the note and tossed it aside. He wouldn't let bitterness creep back into his life. Instead, he grabbed a can of paint and added a fresh coat to the fence, sealing it with strokes of determination. Later that evening, as he sat by the fire pit roasting marshmallows with a group of friends, James reflected on the note. Someone passed him a stick with a gooey marshmallow perched precariously on the end. Laughing, he leaned forward to toast it over the flames. "You know," he said casually, "some folks still think I don't belong here. Funny thing is, I've never felt more at home." His friends nodded knowingly, chiming in with stories of their own struggles to fit in. They talked late into the night, sharing laughter and tears, reminding each other that belonging isn't something given. It's something earned through kindness, patience, and perseverance. Years later, when tourists visited Willow Creek, they often asked about the origins of Freedom Farms. Locals would recount the tale of the fence feud with pride, emphasizing not the conflict but the lessons learned. It was a story of standing firm in the face of adversity, of choosing peace over pettiness, and of building bridges instead of walls. James never sought recognition for what he'd done, but he couldn't deny the impact his actions had on those around him. His farm became a beacon of hope, proving that even the smallest acts of courage can inspire lasting change. And though he still woke up every morning to tend to his crops and animals, he did so knowing that Freedom Farms was more than just a livelihood. It was a legacy. As he stood one final time beneath the sign that started it all, James smiled. The wind rustled through the fields, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he'd face them the same way he always had, with grit, grace, and gratitude. Because at the end of the day, fences might define boundaries, but they can't contain the human spirit. And James Carter's spirit soared higher than any fence ever could.